What I want to talk to you about now, I want to talk to you about our history. You know, whenever one of my most favorite times is, as a family, is usually around the holidays. We'll sit around the dinner table and we'll talk about family stories, things that have happened as a result of our family coming together over the years. Some of the stories are so familiar, we could put a number on them and just read the number out, and everybody that's been there a while, we'd laugh at the, you know, at the appropriate moment, just because that's what families do. And when you join a church, you join a family. We have memories, we have experiences, we have things that God has done in our life that are a part of the family. I got a great email just really about 10 days ago from, it actually wasn't an email, it was a posting in Facebook from a guy who had newly become a member of Gateway Church and had come through the Catch the Vision class, and he started ticking down all of the things of our history, and he said, I feel like I came late to the party. You know, you experienced this. I wasn't there when you did this, when you had this experience, when you were at 2121. I wasn't there when you moved over to the new 114 campus. And he didn't say it this way, but this is the way I read it. I got here as quick as I could. And now I can't wait to be a part of the things that God is doing in this place so that I can be a part of the memories. Well, that's what a family does. And so it's in that context that I want to talk about some of the stories. And I think the place to begin is to talk about how we began. It was for me, let me just personalize a little bit and tell you how I met Pastor Robert. I was in Amarillo, I was pastoring at a church in Amarillo, and I get a call one day, and my assistant says that there's a guy on the phone from Shady Grove Church, and he'd like to talk to you. He's one of the pastors. Well, I was familiar with Shady Grove Church, their reputation, but I had never heard of the guy that was calling. His name was Robert Morris. And so I greet him, and he says that they're in the process of interviewing a person that had been on our staff at the church in Amarillo and had left our staff in not a really great way. And so they were interviewing him for a position, and he wanted to know, through the interview process, it had come up that this guy had been with us and hadn't left properly, and if they were going to hire him, they wanted to repair, if possible, what had taken place, and wanted to know if I'd be willing to reconcile, or we would be willing to reconcile with the guy. And I said, well, it depends. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, it depends on how you would define reconciliation. If we're just going to put a Band-Aid on a situation, probably not. Just get in a room and say, I'm sorry, are you sorry? Yeah, you know, if I did anything wrong, I ask you to forgive me. Probably not interested. But if we really want to deal with the substantive issues that were present, well, yeah. And I have no doubt it's not one way. Maybe there are issues that he would have with us. If we did wrong, we'll own up to our issues, but we got to address the issues in an honest way. And he said, that's exactly what I mean. And I said, okay, good. So Jimmy Evans and I flew to Dallas, and we met with Robert Morris and Olin Griffin at Shady Grove Church to talk about the issues that were between us, Trinity Fellowship, and this guy that had been on our staff. It didn't take very long till we realized he didn't want to deal with his issues, and they realized it. So they kind of dismissed him out of the meeting, and we stayed around and talked. We went and had lunch together, and we developed a friendship. And that friendship spans now over 20 years. And when the friendship started, it was just a friendship. There was an anticipation that when the transition of pastoral leadership took place at Shady Grove, that Robert would be the incoming pastor, senior pastor, when Pastor Olin transitioned the church. And so just when he and Debbie would vacation in the summer, if they were going to vacation in Colorado, they'd come through Amarillo and might spend the night or have dinner. We just developed a friendship, never thinking of what the future might hold in that process. When the day came at Shady Grove for the transition to take place from the senior pastor, Pastor Olin Griffin, to the next pastor, a decision was made that it would go to another guy on the staff and not Robert. And to Robert's credit, it was like, I'm okay with that. God's in charge of my life, but I really feel He's called me to pastor, to senior pastor, and I'd like to be released to plant a church. So they said, well, we'll release you, but, and when I say release, I'm saying release with blessing, with no ill will, but please don't, we don't want to release you for you to start the church right away, because in this transition, if you leave and start a church, you're going to take a bunch of people with you, and you'd split the church, and we've all experienced those kind of scenarios. So he calls one day out of our friendship and says, hey, here's what's going on. We're going to transition the church, and it's not coming to me. And that was shocking news to me. For several years, we'd been in a process of talking with him and others about that. And it just seemed like an abrupt change, but okay. And so I said, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I don't know. Ultimately, I want to pastor a church. I want to plant a church, but they've asked me not to do that immediately. So I said to him in the conversation, why don't you come on our staff? We have an association of churches, about 100 churches or so that are involved in the association. Why don't you come on our staff? You can do pulpit supply and pastoral training and things like that. And you don't have to move. You can stay in Dallas, but because our churches were in the Panhandle, North Texas area. And so that's what he did. For about 7 or 8 months, he was on the staff at Trinity Fellowship in our association of churches, and that's what he did. He helped pastors, he helped churches in the area. And then one day, we get a call from him, and he said, I think it's time. He said, I feel like a woman who is about to give birth. He said, I don't know what that feels like for all you ladies, but he said, you know, I've got to the place where I just can't take it anymore. I feel like something's got to happen. So we said, well, okay, go back to Shady Grove and tell Shady Grove that you really have this urging, you're ready to plant the church, and ask them if they're okay, if their timeline is okay. And if they say yes, then ask them if they want to plant you. So he did that. We went back to Shady Grove. They said, our transition's complete. Thank you. We're good. You're free to do whatever you want. And we think you're more Trinity Fellowship than you are us, so why don't you have Trinity Fellowship plant you? So out of the relationship that at that point had been probably 15 years earlier, an opportunity came for us to participate in something that God was going to do. And we really felt that this area needed a Spirit-filled church in a great way. And we felt that God's hand was on Robert, and there was going to be something great that took place. So we were really honored to participate in the process. And so he brought a group, a core group of leaders that were with him to help start the church, brought him to Amarillo. We introduced him to our congregation in Amarillo, and Jimmy and I became apostolic elders, along with Steve Doolin, who Steve and I are both elders here now, but we were apostolic elders when the church began, which simply means we were elders that weren't resident in the church. We were involved in other areas with other churches, but we provided a covering for the work that began to take place here. Why is that important? I think it's critically important in the history of the church, because when people say to me, they come into the church and they say, you know, this just feels like such a healthy place, such a great place. The reason, in my opinion, that this is a healthy place is because of the way it started. It didn't start out of rebellion. It didn't start out of a reaction from or to something. It started in obedience to God, with dependence upon God for the way that it operated. And I don't know about you, but I'm familiar with, I've been associated in my Christian life, not in my pastoral experience, but in my Christian life, with churches that didn't have the kind of the pure underpinnings of work. They started in reaction to something. Their government was formed out of a response to a hurt that took place, and as a result, the church, as it develops, walks with a limp because of the reaction that was made. And I really believe that one of the reasons that God has so used up until this point Gateway Church is because of the way that it began. It began with a pure heart in response to God, with obedience, covering at every level in the response. A tremendous and powerful part of what God has done here at Gateway.